Okay, so after having some conversations with people, I think there's an important distinction to make between emotions and buried emotions. A couple folks have said to me, look, Dan, I don't know if I have buried emotions or repression because I experience emotions in my daily life. I can feel them, I can express them. For example, there's a guy I'm working with who said to me, I think I should probably pull back on expressing my emotions because I tend to get really angry with people and get in people's faces, lay down the law. There's also a woman I work with who reports that she just cries at the drop of a hat. She feels so sad and sensitive, hypersensitive, almost all the time. And she asked the same question. She said, well, that doesn't sound like repression to me. That's not emotional repression. So I said the same thing to both of them. What you guys are talking about are emotions, yeah? Surface level, everyday emotions. What we're talking about in KI is buried emotions, and that is an entirely different animal. Buried repressed emotions are just that, buried and repressed, really deep in the unconscious body, right? Most people wouldn't even know that they're there, except that they start to experience suffering on the surface of their lives. Suffering like depression, anxiety, addiction, chronic pain. And also the opposite emotional state from whatever emotions are buried in their system. For instance, in my own experience, I was depressed and anxious for years. I used to nap all the time. I avoided people. I'd go to movies and cry by myself, yeah? And even when I got into therapeutic or healing work, I thought that the core of everything for me was grief. I thought dealing with my childhood abandonment wound was the key. So I'd be in a session and I would cry and have a release, and feel a little bit better. But over time, what I started to notice was no matter how many cries and releases I had, the suffering state would always come back. Maybe it would be, a day later, but it would always return. It was like a compulsion to suffer. And I kept thinking to myself, why does this keep coming back? I'm doing my healing work, right? I'm getting to my deep grief and sadness and processing it. So what's the deal? Well, the deal was I wasn't getting to the buried emotions that were really responsible for my suffering. I was dealing with the safer ones that are more on the surface. The first thing that happened when my friend Scott told me that he thought I might repress anger was that I could not understand what he was saying, so I asked him to repeat it, and he had to 3 times, right? After the 3rd time, once I comprehended, the first thing I said was, I'm not angry. Of course I would say that. That's what I've been saying my entire life. And that's what people who repress anger say, because how would we know that we're angry? It's repressed. And so sure enough, when I started to do emotional repression inquiry, I found reservoirs of buried anger and rage in my body that were creating the surface level sadness, depression, and anxiety. It was the driver of my suffering compulsion, right? Since I was so scared of anger, it was safer to be sad and depressed and anxious than it was to access, feel, and express the buried rage. Now, the guy that I mentioned earlier with surface level anger issues, turns out he's a hurt and vulnerability repressor. So he had the opposite experience of me, yeah? He buried hurt, sadness, and grief for his entire life, and he defaulted to the anger and to the aggression. That was his survival strategy in the way that his emotional repression manifested. And of course, the woman I mentioned was also a fellow anger repressor. Both of them are now doing KI, resolving the compulsion to suffer in themselves, and really seeing the difference between emotions and buried emotions. If you'd like to do the same, visit repressiontest.com.